They didn't come to the hospital that night, not one of them. Instead, my phone lit up with photos of balloons, cake, and smiling faces I wasn't part of anymore. That was the moment I understood how quietly a family can let you disappear. I'm a mother of three, living in a modest house at the edge of a small town where evenings settle slowly and news travels faster than comfort. For years, my life revolved around my children, their schedules, their needs, their celebrations. Illness crept in quietly, as it often does, and I assumed love would follow me into that darkness. I was wrong, and that realization unfolded, not in anger, but in silence. The hospital room was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. The light above my bed hummed softly, like it was trying not to disturb me. The clock on the wall clicked louder than my breathing, each second landing heavy in the air. I watched a red hand move, slow and patient, as if it had nowhere else to be. I picked up my phone when the pain eased just enough. My fingers felt dry, unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone older than I remembered being. I called my eldest son first. It rang until the sound stopped on its own. No answer. I left a message, keeping my voice steady, apologizing for calling so late. I said I was fine. I always said that. I waited a moment before calling the next number. Then the next. Each time. The same ringing, each time. The same careful tone in my voicemail. No fear. No urgency. Just a mother trying not to be a burden. The room felt smaller after that. The walls seemed to lean in. Listening, I stared at the phone in my lap, willing it to light up again. It didn't. A nurse came in quietly, her shoes barely making a sound against the floor. She asked how I was feeling, the way people do when they already know the answer. I told her I was okay. She nodded and pulled the blanket higher around my shoulders, tucking it in like she meant it. Her hands were warm. That small kindness landed harder than it should have when she left. The silence returned, heavier than before. I turned my head toward the window. It was dark outside, the kind of dark that erases edges. Somewhere beyond that glass, life was still moving. I unlocked my phone again, this time without calling anyone. My thumb opened an app without thinking, and there they were. Photos filled the screen. Bright lights. A table crowded with food. Smiling faces leaning close together. My children, all of them. My daughter-in-law in the center, wearing a dress I recognized because I'd helped her choose it. It was her birthday. I remembered now. They looked happy. Not rushed. Not distracted. Present. The kind of present they hadn't been with me that night. I scrolled slowly, each picture sinking deeper than the last. A cake. Candles. Arms around shoulders. And no one looked toward the camera the way people do when they're missing someone. I waited for the feeling that usually came, the instinct to defend them. They're busy. They didn't know. It wasn't intentional, but it didn't arrive. Instead, there was just a quiet understanding. Soft. Certain. I locked the phone and set it face down on the tray beside my bed. The room went dimmer somehow. Though the light hadn't changed, the clock kept ticking, the machines kept breathing for me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the images behind my eyes. Not angry. Not crying. Just aware. At some point, the screen went dark on its own, and in that darkness, a question settled gently into my chest. Not sharp, not loud, just steady. The room stayed dim even after the nurse came back to check the monitors. Night pressed itself against the window, thick and unmoving. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled softly, then faded. I lay still, the phone resting where I'd left it, face down, like it was ashamed of what it showed me. I told myself not to look again. I told myself it didn't matter. But the mind is a restless thing when the body is trapped. I turned the phone over. The light from the screen cut through the room too sharply. Another photo had been posted. Then another. The party kept going. Streamers hung from the ceiling in looping colors, Someone had chosen warm lighting, the kind that makes everyone look softer than they are. There was music, I imagined, laughter spilling over itself. I could almost hear it. Even through the hospital walls, I recognized the dining room, the long table, the framed pictures slightly crooked near the doorway. I had wiped that table clean just a week before. I had suggested the flowers, white ones, because they photographed well. My daughter-in-law held a glass up in one picture, smiling wide. My son stood beside her, his hand light on her back. The others leaned in, close enough to blur the edges between them. They looked like a single unit. Complete. I searched the photos the way people search crowds at airports, scanning faces, corners, reflections in glass.as if I might find myself there by accident. I didn't. The comments rolled in beneath the images. Little hearts, short wishes, beautiful night. So glad we could all be together. All. The word sat heavy. I set the phone down again. Slower this time. My hand trembled. Just slightly. Not from fear. From something quieter. I thought about the calls I'd made earlier. How careful I'd been with my voice. How I'd softened the edges of the truth so it wouldn't scare them. I wondered if they'd seen the missed calls light up their screens, if they'd glanced at them before slipping the phone back into a pocket just for tonight. They might have thought. The clock ticked on. The 4 hummed. The room breathed without me. I turned my head and caught my reflection in the dark window. My face looked pale, older. Hospital light does that, it strips away whatever strength you're pretending to have. I barely recognized the woman staring back. I thought about all the times I'd rearranged my own life for theirs, skipped rest, delayed care, waited. There was always another event, another celebration, another reason to come second. I wondered when that order had been decided, if it happened slowly, like dust settling, or all at once, without anyone noticing. A laugh echoed faintly from down the hall. Someone visiting a room nearby. Someone showing up. I closed my eyes and let the darkness come back. Behind my eyelids, the party light still flickered, warm, distant, unreachable. And, in that soft glow, a new feeling began to form. Not anger. Not grief. Distance. Quiet. Unannounced. Like a door left open just long enough for someone to step away without being seen. Morning arrived without asking. The light crept in through the blinds, thin and colorless, like it wasn't sure it belonged there. The machines slowed their chatter. The night loosened its grip. A doctor stood at the foot of my bed, flipping through papers, speaking gently but quickly. He said I was stable. He said I could go home. Home. The word sounded different than it used to. I nodded. I always nod. They handed me discharge papers in a manila folder that felt too light for what it carried. A nurse helped me into my coat, careful around the soreness I hadn't named out loud. She asked if someone was coming to get me. I said yes before thinking, then corrected myself. I'll take a cab. She didn't ask anything else, just smiled in that way people do when they don't want to embarrass you. She walked me to the doors and wished me well. Her footsteps faded behind me, outside. The air was sharp, clean in a way hospital air never is. The cab smelled faintly of old coffee and vinyl. The driver asked for the address. I gave it to him like it was a place I still belonged. We drove through streets that looked unchanged. Morning. Routines unfolding as if nothing had paused overnight. People walking dogs, a woman watering plants, life continuing without checking if I'd made it through. I rested my head against the window. The glass was cold, grounding. When we reached my house, the driver got out and opened the trunk. I paid him and thanked him too much. He nodded and drove away before I made it to the door. The key stuck, the way it always had. I twisted it harder than necessary. The door creaked open, slow and familiar, like it recognized me before anyone else did. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and something cooked days ago. Still, unmoved. A vase of flowers sat on the table by the window, wilted, their water cloudy. I stared at them longer than I should have, wondering how many days they'd been like that. I set my bag down and leaned against the wall, catching my breath. The quiet pressed in, thick but not cruel, just honest. I walked room to room, touching things without meaning to: the back of a chair, the edge of the counter, places my hands had learned by heart. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been missed. In the bedroom, my bed waited, neatly made, pillows still stacked the way I'd left them. I sat on the edge and listened to the house settle around me. And no messages. And no missed calls. I lay back slowly, shoes still on, staring at the ceiling fan that hadn't been turned on in months. It looked like it was waiting for instructions. I thought about how many times I'd imagined this moment differently: someone unlocking the door ahead of me, a voice asking how I felt, hand steadying me as I sat. Instead, there was just me, breathing, present. And in that stillness, something shifted, not sharply, not all at once, just a quiet understanding taking root. I had come home alone that afternoon. The light lingered longer than I expected. It stretched across the living room floor in pale rectangles, warming the places my feet hadn't reached yet. Dust floated through it slowly, like it had nowhere else to go. I sat by the window and watched the day move without me. The house made its usual sounds, a pipe knocking once behind the wall, the refrigerator humming, steady and patient. It felt like the house was checking on me in the only ways it knew how. I rested my hands in my lap and studied them. The skin thinner than it used to be, veins more visible. Hands that had wiped noses, tied shoes, packed lunches before sunrise. Hands that had learned how to stay busy so the heart wouldn't have to speak without meaning to. I began remembering my eldest, small and stubborn, standing in the doorway on his first day of school, refusing to let go of my coat. My daughter's laugh filling the kitchen when she learned how to flip pancakes without dropping them. The youngest, sick one winter night, his fever breaking just before dawn while I sat awake counting his breaths. I had been there for all of it, every scraped knee, every late-night phone call, every moment they didn't know how to carry alone. The memories came quietly, one after another, like they had been waiting for the house to empty. They didn't hurt at first. They felt warm, familiar. I stood and walked to the hallway, where a strip of pencil marks still lived on the wall behind a picture frame. I moved the frame aside and traced the lines with my finger. Dates, ages, proof that time had passed and I had watched it closely. I wondered when I had stopped being watched. Back. In the kitchen, I opened a drawer and found an old birthday card, folded soft from being handled too often. Crayon letters, misspelled words. I love you forever, written without knowing how long forever could be. I sat at the table and held the card open, letting the quiet sit between the words and the woman I had become. I searched the years for a moment where I might have stepped wrong, where I might have taught them something I didn't mean to. Had I made it too easy? Had I been too available? Had my constancy taught them that I would always be there even when they weren't? The house didn't answer. It only listened. Outside, a car passed slowly, somewhere nearby. Someone laughed, life brushing past the edges of my thoughts. I folded the card and placed it back in the drawer. Not with anger, with care. I returned to the window and sat again, the light now thinner, retreating inch by inch. The day was ending, whether I was ready or not. I realized then that love doesn't disappear all at once. It thins. It stretches. It waits to see if anyone will notice. And as the room darkened, one quiet question settled beside me. Heavier than the rest. Had I taught them how to need me, but never how to stay? The phone rang just as the light finished leaving the room. One clean sound, sharp enough to make me look up from nothing. I didn't reach for it right away. I watched it vibrate against the table, the screen lighting up a name I knew by heart. My youngest, The one who used to sleep with the hallway light on. The one who always said she'd call back and usually did. Eventually, I answered on the third ring. "Hi, Mom," she said, already halfway somewhere else. Her voice was bright, careful, the kind people use when they're trying not to step on anything fragile. I told her hello. My voice surprised me. It sounded normal. She apologized quickly, like she'd practiced it. Said the night got busy. Said there was confusion. Said she didn't realize how serious things were. Her words stacked neatly, one on top of the other, leaving no space between them. I listened. I always had. She asked if I was home now, if I'd eaten, if I needed groceries picked up later in the week. Practical questions. Safe questions. "I'm fine," I said. The phrase slipped out easily. Worn smooth from years of use, there was a pause, then just long enough for something else to fit inside it. But she filled it. "We'll come by soon," she said. "Not today." Soon. A word with no weight. I looked at the wall while she talked. A faint scuff near the baseboard where a toy had once hit too hard. I remembered cleaning it, thinking I'd fix it properly someday. I never did. She didn't ask how I felt. Not really. She didn't ask if I'd been scared or lonely, or if I'd looked for them in the room and felt that quiet drop when no one came. She told me about the party. How nice it turned out. How happy everyone was. As if happiness were something you could report on, like the weather. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. When the call ended, the house seemed to exhale. The phone went still in my hand, warm where she'd been. I sat there longer than necessary, staring at the dark screen, waiting for the feeling that used to come after calls like that. Relief, reassurance, connection. It didn't. Instead, there was a strange clarity. Like when fog lifts slowly and you realize the road has been empty for miles. I set the phone down and stood up, my legs steady beneath me. I walked to the sink and rinsed an empty cup that didn't need washing. The water ran. The sound filled the space she hadn't. I understood then that love doesn't always leave loudly. Sometimes it just changes shape, becomes polite, becomes scheduled, becomes something you check in on instead of something that shows up. That night, I turned off the lights one by one. The house went dark in stages, familiar and calm, and as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought stayed with me. Not angry, not accusing, just clear. Being remembered is not the same as being chosen. The days that followed moved carefully around me. Nothing urgent, nothing loud. Just time doing what it does best, revealing patterns. Messages came in, scattered and brief. A reminder about an appointment I already knew. A forwarded photo from the party I didn't open. No one asked if the house felt too quiet. No one asked if I slept. I began to notice how decisions were made now, plans discussed somewhere else, then delivered to me fully formed, times chosen, priorities set. I was informed, not included. When my son stopped by one afternoon, he stood in the doorway instead of sitting down. He smiled, polite, quick. He asked how I was feeling. Already glancing at his watch, I told him the truth this time, or a softer version of it. "I'm tired." He nodded like that made sense, like it was expected. He talked about work, about how busy things had been, about how his wife had been stressed lately and needed support. I listened, my hands folded in my lap, the way they'd learned to be when the heart had something else to say. "She's been going through a lot," he said. The words hovered between us. I waited for him to ask about me. He didn't. I saw it then, clearly. Not as cruelty. Not as neglect. As order. There was a hierarchy now. Unspoken. Carefully maintained. Her comfort came first, framed as peacekeeping. The children's schedules came next, framed as necessity. And me, I fit wherever there was space left over. I had been demoted without a conversation, without a warning, just slowly moved to the edge of things until no one noticed I was standing there. When he left, he hugged me lightly, the kind of hug that doesn't want to linger. He said he'd call soon. I closed the door and rested my forehead against it for a moment. The wood was cool, solid. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table long after dinner. The chair across from me stayed empty, its shadow stretching toward mine. I traced the grain of the wood with my finger, following lines worn down by years of use. I thought about how often I had swallowed discomfort to keep things smooth, how many times I'd said, "It's okay," when it wasn't, how often I'd step back so someone else could feel settled. I realized then that I had taught them something without meaning to, that I would always adjust, always wait, always understand. And because of that, they never learned how to stop. The house creaked softly as it cooled for the night. Outside, a porch light flicked on somewhere down the street. Someone choosing visibility. I stayed where I was, hands still, breath steady. There was no anger in me, just a quiet reckoning. Love hadn't left this family. It had been rearranged, and for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. If this is where I stand now, how much longer can I keep pretending it doesn't hurt? The decision didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like dust on a shelf no one checks anymore. By the time I noticed it, it already felt permanent. I started with the hall closet, not because it mattered, but because it was close. Coats I hadn't worn in years hung there, shoulders slumped, pockets still holding old receipts. I touched each one, then left most of them where they were. I packed only what I needed. Clothes that felt like me. Shoes that didn't ask much of my feet. Nothing that required explaining. The house stayed quiet while I moved through it, not watching, not judging, just allowing. In the bedroom, I opened drawers I'd organized 100 times before, folded sweaters I'd worn to school meetings, birthdays, waiting rooms. Each one carried a version of me I didn't need to bring along. I stopped at the dresser and picked up a photograph, all of us standing close together. Years ago, sunlight on our faces, my arm around someone's shoulder. I held it for a moment, then placed it face down. I wasn't leaving because I was angry. That mattered to me. I was leaving because something in me had gone quiet, and I needed to hear it again. I found a small box in the back of the closet. Inside were letters I'd written but never sent. Apologies for things I wasn't sure I'd done wrong, explanations no one had asked for. I skimmed one, then closed the box. It didn't come with me. In the kitchen, I packed a single mug, the chipped one I always reached for first. It fit my hand the way it always had. Some things are in their place. I folded clothes carefully, not because they needed it, but because I did. The act felt grounding, deliberate, like choosing words before speaking. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not out of secrecy, out of clarity. If I explained, they would soften, promise visits, offer reasons, and I would listen. I always did. This wasn't something I wanted to talk my way out of. As evening came, the rooms grew darker one by one. I paused in the doorway of each, letting memory brush past without grabbing hold. The living room where we'd celebrated too many things to count. The hallway where laughter once ran freely. The front door. My bag rested quietly by my feet, smaller than I expected, lighter than it should have been. I looked around one last time. Not with regret, with recognition. I wasn't abandoning them. I was stepping out of a role that had learned how to erase me. The lock clicked softly when I tested it. The sound carried more weight than I thought it would, and as I turned off the last light, one truth followed me into the quiet. Sometimes leaving isn't a declaration, it's a whisper. I wrote the letter at the kitchen table just before dawn. The house was still asleep, the kind of stillness that feels earned. A thin line of light crept in through the curtains, barely enough to see the page. I didn't turn on the lamp. I wanted the words to come out honest, not polished. The pen felt heavier than it should have. I held it for a while before the first sentence appeared. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I did. I didn't accuse. I made sure of that. No sharp edges. No tally of wrongs. I wrote about the hospital room, about the clock, about how quiet it felt when the calls went unanswered. I didn't say it hurt. I said it changed something. I told them I understood how life fills up, how days stack on top of each other until you forget what's underneath. I told them I didn't blame anyone for choosing joy, only that I had noticed when I wasn't chosen at all. The words came slowly, then all at once, like something waiting for permission. I paused often, listening to the refrigerator hum, the floor creak as the house shifted. I imagined them reading the letter later, standing where I was standing now, coffee cooling beside them. I wondered which line would make them stop. I wrote about love, how it doesn't vanish, even when it's neglected, how it just learns to be quiet. I told them I loved them still, fully, without conditions. That part was easy. What wasn't easy was the rest. I told them I was leaving, not because I wanted distance, but because I needed air. I told them I could no longer stay in a place where my absence was easier than my presence. I asked them not to rush after me with apologies, not to promise changes they hadn't practiced before. I folded the paper carefully when I was done. The crease ran straight down the middle, clean and final. I placed it on the kitchen table, weighted by a small stone I kept near the window, something solid, something that wouldn't blow away. The room looked different then, not emptier, just finished. I stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the back of the chair. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, steadier than I remembered. Older, yes, but clearer. I didn't cry. That surprised me. Some goodbyes don't come with tears, they come with relief. I picked up my bag and moved toward the door. The letter stayed where it was, quiet and patient. It didn't need me anymore. As I stepped outside, the morning air met me gently, cool, honest. Behind me, the house held my words. Ahead of me, a road waited, not dramatic, not grand, just open. And I knew then that by the time they read the letter, I would already be gone, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The town by the sea didn't ask me anything. That was the first thing I noticed. The road narrowed as I arrived, houses spaced farther apart, paint faded by years of wind and salt. The air smelled different, sharp, clean, alive. I rolled down the window and let it rush in, filling places I hadn't realized were empty. My new place was small. One bedroom, one window that faced the water if you leaned just enough to the left. The landlord handed me a single key and pointed out the mailbox. No questions. No history required. Inside, the floor creaked softly, like it was introducing itself. I set my bag down and stood still, listening. No echoes of other people. No expectations hanging in the air. That night, I slept with the window cracked open. The sound of waves moved in and out like breathing. I woke before dawn without an alarm. The room washed in pale blue light. For the first time in a long while, my chest felt light. Mornings became my favorite part of the day. I walked the shoreline slowly, shoes in my hand, sand cool beneath my feet. Seagulls argued overhead. The tide erased my footprints almost as soon as I made them. And no one knew me there. That mattered more than I expected. The calf on the corner, the woman behind the counter, learned my order by the end of the week. She called me dear without meaning anything by it. It felt kind, simple. My body began to heal in ways the doctors hadn't mentioned. Not all at once. Gradually. Less tightness. Better sleep. Fewer nights staring at the ceiling. Some evenings, I sat on the small porch and watched the sky darken over the water. The horizon held steady no matter how the waves changed. That felt like a lesson. I didn't think about my children every day. When I did, it wasn't sharp anymore. It was distant. Like remembering a room you once lived in but no longer need directions to find. Once, my phone buzzed with a message I didn't open right away. I watched it light up the table, then go dark again. I chose when to look. That was new. I realized I had spent years measuring my worth by how needed I was. Here, I wasn't needed at all. And somehow, that made me feel whole. The sea kept its own time. It didn't hurry. It didn't apologize. It came and went as it pleased. Standing there one morning, wind tugging gently at my sleeves, I understood something quietly. Healing doesn't always come from fixing what broke. Sometimes, it comes from leaving it behind and learning how to breathe in a plaza that doesn't ask you to shrink. Months had passed. The mornings were cooler now, the wind carrying a sharper salt scent. I had grown used to the rhythm of this town, the quiet of my own schedule, the weight of no one expecting me. Then the phone rang. A number I recognized immediately. Familiar. Too familiar. I hesitated before answering. The receiver felt heavier in my hand than it had before. I pressed it to my ear. Mom. Her voice was tight, urgent this time. Not cheerful. Not distracted. I hadn't heard it like that in years. I listened as they explained regret, oversight, panic. They said they hadn't realized. They hadn't understood. They hadn't thought I'd leave. I said nothing at first. Just held the phone. The words bounced lightly between us, none landing fully. I watched my reflection in the dark window across from me, steadier than it had been months ago, older, yes, but calmer. They apologized, stumbling over themselves, promises made, almost desperate in tone. I nodded even though they couldn't see me. Some part of me wanted to say yes. To go back. To fold myself into their lives again, but I didn't. Instead, I listened. I heard the weight of their words, the spaces where sincerity met panic. I acknowledged it without needing to return to the old patterns. I could feel the difference immediately, the calm in my chest, the lightness in my arms. I told them I loved them. I always did. But I could no longer be the person I had been before. I could no longer erase myself for their comfort. It was soft, firm, and true. There were questions I didn't answer. There were explanations I didn't give. Not because I wanted to punish, because I had finally learned to protect the quiet space that belonged only to me. After the call, the house returned to its rhythm. The sea outside whispered, tide washing away footprints I had left too long ago. I set the phone down. The screen went dark. I walked to the porch and watched the horizon. The sky was pale, fading slowly into the evening. For the first time in months, I felt completely untethered, not alone, but whole. I realized then that love doesn't demand constant presence. It doesn't always need permission to exist. Sometimes, it's enough to hear it without returning. The light slipped behind the waves. The air was sharp against my face, and I understood, finally, that being noticed doesn't always mean being chosen. Some truths live in the quiet. Some choices are theirs, and some belong entirely to me. The sun slipped slowly toward the horizon, painting the water gold and gray. I stood on my porch, hands wrapped around a mug that had traveled with me from house to house. The breeze tugged at my sleeves, teasing loose strands of hair across my face. It felt like the first time I was really breathing in years. I thought about them, my children, my family, and the distance between us. Not the miles, but the space I had carved for myself when love wasn't returned the way I needed it to be. I didn't feel anger anymore. Not really. Just clarity, quiet and steady, like the tide rolling in. The house behind me was small, imperfect, alive. It didn't ask me to fit into someone else's schedule or soothe invisible tensions. It didn't demand my presence. It offered a space to exist fully, without apology. For the first time, I felt like I belonged to myself. I let the silence stretch, letting the wind carry the last traces of doubt and expectation away. There was no need for them to understand. And no need for forgiveness. And no need for anyone but me. I realized then that love could exist in many forms. The love I had poured into them hadn't disappeared. It had only found a new home within me. And that was enough. The waves whispered against the shore, relentless and patient, reminding me that life moves forward whether we follow or not. I could choose the pain of absence or the freedom of presence. I chose presence. I chose myself. I took a slow sip from my mug and let the warmth settle in my chest. The horizon held a promise I hadn't known I was waiting for, a life unshaped by others' choices, yet filled with quiet, deliberate beauty. I thought about calling them. I thought about explaining everything, but the truth was already clear. Some doors don't open again, and some bridges burn gently, leaving smoke that smells like liberation. I smiled, soft, almost without realizing it. And no one had asked me to be whole before. Now I finally could, and as the last light faded, painting the sky with streaks of violet and fire, I whispered to the wind, not to anyone else, I am here, I am mine, and this is only the beginning. For the first time, I understood. The story of a mother doesn't end when they walk away. It begins when she chooses herself.